The most morbid time capsule ever, an airman found encased entirely in ice. And that's not even the most shocking story today. Did you know there's physical evidence that Hitler secretly lived after the war? The Frozen Airman. What's the worst thing you came face to face with while scaling a glacier? Snowy Bigfoot? A secret city of ice? Or the pasty face of a frigid corpse? Two ice climbers found themselves facing off with the latter. They were scaling the glacier, enjoying the view, maybe wondering why they even decided to climb a giant frozen rock in the first place, when they spotted it. A frozen head, part of a shoulder, and one arm sticking out of the ice like a tragic human popsicle. This unexpected discovery took place in Kings Canyon National Park, not exactly the first place that comes to mind when you think of a frozen corpse from World War II, because that's exactly where this corpse was from. The discovery kicked off a rescue mission, though rescue might not be the right word when the guy has been waiting for help since 1942. Rangers, military specialists, and forensic experts set up camp in the freezing wilderness to carefully extract the airman, who was still wearing his army-issued parachute and remarkably still had some intact sandy blonde hair. Seriously, what conditioner was he using? Officials believed the airman had been part of an AT-7 navigational training plane that crashed into Mount Mendel on November 18, 1942. It took off from Mather Field in California with 5 hours of fuel but never returned to base. The wreckage, along with 4 other crew members, was found in 1947, but it seems one of them took a slightly longer rest inside a glacier before making his grand reappearance. Military forensic experts hope to identify the remains using numbers found on the body. And considering that glaciers work like nature's deep freezer, they were optimistic. Soft tissue, clothing, and even documents sometimes survive under ice. And it turned out they could identify him. The frozen body is that of Ernest G. Munn, missing since his training flight vanished over the Sierra Nevada in 1942 on November 18th, just like officials first thought. He was only 23 years old at the time. Ernest's remains were found at the bottom of a glacier in a remote area so isolated that it takes days to reach on foot. The crash site itself is marked on an old military map with an ominous X, because apparently real life does come with buried treasure maps. Believe it or not, this isn't the first time Frozen Airmen have made a ghoulish comeback. Military teams have previously recovered missing servicemen from extreme locations, including a Cold War-era officer found in Greenland. You might be shocked to learn there are around 88,000 Americans still classified as missing in action from past wars. Of those, roughly 78,000 are from World War II, but with many lost at sea, only about 35,000 are considered recoverable. When military scientists aren't pulling lost airmen from glaciers, they're busy running one of the most intense forensic detective operations in history, identifying about 2 missing service members per week. What would your reaction be to finding a frozen corpse on your scenic hike? Skull fragment proves Hitler lived. Have you ever wondered what happened to Hitler's body? Is it resting in a nondescript grave in some cemetery in Berlin? Is it in a secret bunker where no one will ever see it? Or was he just sort of thrown in the trash at the end of the war? Or, final option, did Adolf Hitler escape death? For decades, the world has been told the same story. On April 30th, 1945, with Russian bombs shaking Berlin, Adolf Hitler did the world a favor by swallowing a cyanide pin and a bullet in his bunker. His body was then carried outside, doused in gasoline, and set on fire like the worst barbecue ever. No burial, no casket, no tomb, no funeral. Fire, ashes, gone. Case closed, right? Not so fast. For years, a fragment of skull with a bullet hole taken by the Soviets from Hitler's bunker was held up as proof that Adolf did, in fact, die. That is, until 2009, when things changed forever. A group of American researchers threw a wrench in the whole story by proving that the skull wasn't Hitler's at all. In fact, it wasn't even a man's skull. The only proof that Hitler died was debunked more than 10 years ago, but to no one's surprise, mainstream historians don't want to talk about it. Oops. Archaeologist Nick Bellantoni, who examined the relic in Moscow, noticed something weird. The skull was too thin for a male, and the sutures in the bone suggested the person had been under 40 years old. Since Hitler was 56 when he died, well, Houston, we have a problem. Belle and Tony took DNA samples, shipped them to the University of Connecticut, and had geneticist Linda Strasbourg take a closer look. After 3 days of testing, they got the bombshell result. The skull belonged to a woman, and not just any woman, a completely unidentified one. So, whose skull is it? That's the million-dollar question. Could it be Ava Brown's? Not likely. Ava was 33, but all historical accounts say she took cyanide, not a bullet. Plus, if she had been shot, the Nazis weren't exactly in the habit of keeping it a secret. The skull could have been any of the countless people killed near the bunker in those final chaotic days. All scientists know for sure is that this supposed proof of Hitler's demise has been flushed down the historical toilet. And as it turns out, a lot of powerful people already knew the truth. For example, the leader of Soviet Russia. Joseph Stalin himself never fully believed the official story. After the war, he was so paranoid that Hitler had escaped that he sent multiple teams to Berlin to dig up more evidence. In 1946, a second Soviet group thought they found the missing piece, our notorious skull fragment with a bullet wound. That, along with Hitler's jawbone and some blood-stained bits of bunker sofa, was locked away in Soviet intelligence archives for decades. In 2000, Russia finally put the skull on display in an exhibition called The Agony of the Third Reich. Sergei Mironenko, the head of the Russian State Archive, confidently declared it to be Hitler's skull. Well, Sergei, I've got some bad news for you. It isn't Hitler's skull. Now, what does all this mean? Did Hitler fake his death and live out his days sipping margaritas in Argentina? The answer is less convincing than you might think. With the skull proven to not be Hitler's, the next biggest piece of forensic evidence is Hitler's jawbone, which was also recovered by the Soviets and reportedly matched his dental records. But since no public photos exist, the world is taking their word for it. In 1970, the KGB decided to get rid of Hitler's remains for good, cremating them and dumping the ashes in a river. So no single bone survives to give us any more details. For all anyone knows, Hitler lived to be 105 in a quiet Argentinian village. What do you think really happened to Hitler? Let me know in the comments. And now for a quick break. But first, I wanted to give a shout out and big thank you to There by the Moon and Cinnamon Susie for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Man Who Fooled Hitler. There was once a man who was such a good liar that his lies contributed to winning World War II. Maybe you know someone who has a similar skill set. His name was Juan Puyol Garcia. This guy created an entire fake network of spies, bamboozled the Nazis, and somehow convinced both Britain and Germany to give him medals. The same man got an Iron Cross from Hitler and an MBE from King George VI. That's what I call playing both sides. Garcia, a Spaniard with an impressive ability to make up nonsense on the fly, was so convincing in his deception that the British named him Garbo after Greta Garbo, the famously mysterious actress. At the same time, the Nazis thought they had recruited a top-tier agent codenamed Alaric. The craziest part is that Garcia, who convinced everyone he had a vast spy network that he directly controlled, didn't have a single spy in his employ. His entire spy network was about as real as your childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut. Born in Barcelona, Garcia started life in the most unspy-like profession possible: poultry farming. The man who would later hoodwink Hitler spent his early years wrangling chickens. When World War II kicked off, Garcia was determined to help Britain. He tried 3 times to offer his services to British intelligence, but they ghosted him harder than a bad Tinder date. In classic spy movie fashion, he did the next best thing. He tricked the Germans into recruiting him first, just so he could double-cross them later. Despite claiming to be a top-level agent in London, Garcia faked everything from Lisbon, using tourist guides, magazines, and imagination to convince the Germans he was traveling across Britain collecting intel. He even used the British Railway Guide to expense fictional train fares. This guy invoiced the Nazis for trips he never even took. Garcia's biggest act of deception was feeding the Germans misinformation about the D-Day invasion. Through over 500 messages, sometimes 20 a day, he painted a picture of an Allied attack focused on the Strait of Dover rather than Normandy. The Germans bought it hook, line, and sinker, keeping their forces in the wrong location while the real invasion happened elsewhere. To add insult to injury, the Nazis paid Garcia $340,000 to support his network of spies, which only existed in his imagination. He created 27 fake agents, complete with intricate backstories, expenses, and reports. MI5 must have had a blast watching him fabricate an entire intelligence operation that didn't exist. Even after everything, the Germans gave him the Iron Cross, one of their highest military honors. Meanwhile, the British made him an official member of the Order of the British Empire for his services in deceiving the enemy. That's the story of a poultry farmer turned master of deception who tricked the Nazis, saved countless lives, and got paid handsomely for his lies. If anyone ever deserved an Oscar for best performance in a war, it was Juan Puyol Garcia, who left their plane under 300 feet of ice. Think of how embarrassing it would be to lose your car in a snowstorm. Now think of how embarrassing it would be to find that car 50 years later under a whopping 300 feet of ice. Swap the car for a World War II fighter plane, and you've got the incredible story of the Lost Squadron. In July 1942, 6 P-38 Lightning fighters and 2 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers were on their way to support the Allied war efforts when Mother Nature hit them with a full-blown blizzard over Greenland. The pilots, realizing they were in a pickle, had no choice but to make an emergency landing on the icy terrain. Luckily, all crew members were rescued 9 days later, though of course they still had to spend almost 2 weeks in the freezing cold of Greenland's endless ice. Their planes were not so lucky. For the next several decades, the icy grip of Greenland swallowed the aircraft whole, burying them underneath enough ice to bury an apartment building. 50 years later, in 1992, one of the P-38s, nicknamed Glacier Girl, was miraculously recovered and restored to flying condition. Now, 30 years after that, modern technology and some seriously determined history buffs have uncovered another one of those lost warbirds. The team behind this icy excavation is Arctic Hotpoint Solutions, a non-profit that specializes in finding lost history in the most extreme places. Their search for the Lost Squadron started in 2011, using radar to scan beneath Greenland's ice. In 2023, they kicked things up a notch, deploying fancy new ground-penetrating radar mounted on drones. If you're hunting buried treasure, you might as well use the coolest gadgets available. After picking up some promising signals, the team had to confirm they were actually looking at a buried plane and not, say, a large rock or a frozen woolen mammoth. Their solution was a heat probe powered by a high-pressure washer system. They melted their way down through the ice to touch whatever was down there. Jem Salazar, co-founder of Arctic Hotpoint Solutions, said when they pulled the probe back up, it was covered in a thick red substance. The team realized it was 5606 hydraulic fluid, the aviation equivalent of finding a plane's blood. The recovered aircraft has been identified as the P-38 Echo, originally piloted by Robert Wilson on that fateful day in 1942. With support from Greenland, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the recovery team geared up for a full-scale extraction mission. But the hunt isn't over yet. There are still 6 more aircraft from the Lost Squadron buried somewhere under the ice, and Arctic Hotpoint Solutions has even bigger ambitions. Just 20 miles from the Lost Squadron's location at Coage Bay, the team is searching for a Coast Guard Grumman J-2F Duck. The Duck is believed to contain the remains of 3 missing airmen. Salazar and his team are determined to bring these aircraft and their stories back to the surface. While Greenland's ice may have hidden these warbirds for decades, history has a funny way of refusing to stay buried. A treasure, Norse runes, and dark Nazi ideology. Just when you think you're digging up a harmless Viking trinket, it turns out to be wrapped up in insane Nazi ideas. Something very shiny was unearthed at Verløse Airfield in Denmark, with a dark twist. In 1944, some random Danish guy casually called up the National Museum of Denmark and said, "Hey, I think I found a skeleton and some jewelry in a field." Okay, definitely not your everyday phone call. Museum Inspector C.L. Verbeek rushed to the site, though it wasn't easy to get past the German red tape. When Verbeek finally got access to the field, he discovered scattered skeletal remains and antique artifacts, including a brooch known as a Rosetta fibula. Sounds cool, right? It was, until Verbeek flipped the artifact over and saw a swastika on it. This wasn't your typical swastika. It was the ancient Norse sun emblem, which does look identical to a swastika. What a lot of people don't realize is that the swastika was used by the Vikings 1,000 years before the Nazis came along. It was a symbol of solar deities, preceding even gods like Thor and Odin. Alas, the Nazis stole the symbol. By 1945, nobody wanted to look at it anymore. Hey, can you blame them? Denmark's newspapers were so done with Nazi propaganda that when they reported on the brooch in March 1945, they edited the swastika out of the photos. No mention of it, no awkward explanations, just a clean-cut Viking relic with no unfortunate associations. If only all of history's bad ideas could be erased that easily. There is a reason why Germany appropriated the swastika. Nazis were obsessed with ancient Norse symbols. They wanted to trace their so-called superior race back to Nordic roots. Hitler's SS went all in on the rune madness, assigning new meanings to ancient runes. The Sun rune became Sigruna, the victory rune. The O rune, which originally meant inheritance, was repurposed as the terrifying Blut and Boden, the blood and soil symbol. The Verlos brooch isn't the only place Nazi symbolism popped up where it didn't belong. In Scotland, a swastika was discovered carved into the stone of Old Wick Castle. At first, historians thought it dated to the Nordic sea kings of the 10th century, until someone noticed Roman numerals right next to it. A Nazi POW who had been forced to work in the surrounding farm fields carved MCMXLVI, which means 1946, into the stone. Did the guy know he was carving a Nazi symbol onto an actual Viking stronghold? Or was he just being a Nazi jerk? The secrets of Death Island. If you think your local government keeps secrets, wait until you hear about Grunard Island, the small Scottish island that spent nearly 50 years as an off-limits biohazard zone, all thanks to some questionable World War II science experiments. Diabolical experiments involving anthrax and some unfortunate sheep. Welcome to the Island of Death. In 1962, BBC reporter Fife Robertson stood across from Grunard Island, hair blowing in the wind like he was in a spy thriller, and said, "Hereabouts they call it the Island of Death, the Mystery Island, and for good reason." No, it wasn't haunted. No, it wasn't cursed. It had been the secret playground of government scientists who turned it into a massive biological weapons testing site in 1942. Why? Because anthrax bombs, that's why. They called it Operation Vegetarian. Get your giggles out now, because although the name is silly, the experiments were terrifying. It all started when the UK's Ministry of Defence decided that biological warfare was the next big thing. Paul Filders, head of the biology department at Porton Down, a military research facility famous for its controversial experiments, had a bright idea. He would weaponize anthrax to cripple Nazi Germany's food supply. The plan was to infect millions of linseed cakes with anthrax spores, drop them into German cattle pastures, let the cows munch on them, and watch as anthrax spread like a medieval plague. This would have resulted in a full-scale food crisis and a lot of dead cows and people. It was horribly inhumane. Before unleashing this nightmarish biological attack, the UK needed a test site. Somewhere isolated where no one would accidentally stumble into a cloud of weaponized death. Over the summer of 1942, the military bought Grunard Island and got to work. They tethered sheep at different distances downwind of anthrax bombs, then remotely detonated them. I wish I could say no animals were harmed, but I can't. Scientists studied the corpses of many slain sheep, then burned or buried their remains under piles of rubble like that would somehow fix the problem. What ended up happening was the UK created one of the worst biological weapons ever, and in the process made a whole island uninhabitable. By 1943, the UK had what they needed, the knowledge that anthrax would obliterate anything in its path. The linseed cakes were produced, but the plan was scrapped when the Allies decided to go with a more traditional approach. You know, storming beaches and shooting guns. Grunard Island was left a ticking biohazard time bomb. Anthrax is not the kind of bacteria that just disappears. It can stay in soil for decades, waiting to infect anything unfortunate enough to step on it. Locals started noticing that animals on the mainland were mysteriously dying, and when people started asking questions, the UK government was like, I don't know. For decades, the island sat abandoned, but not everyone was willing to forget about Grunard. In 1981, a group called the Dark Harvest Commandos, who sound like either eco-terrorists or an underground metal band, landed on the island, scooped up anthrax-laden soil, and dumped it outside Porton Down as a message to the government. After decades of failed decontamination attempts, scientists finally tried something that worked. They soaked the entire island in formaldehyde and seawater while removing and incinerating contaminated topsoil. On April 24, 1990, 48 years after Operation Vegetarian, the UK declared Grunard Island anthrax-free. Hooray! Grunard wasn't the only place the UK tested biological weapons, but it was definitely the most infamous. It became a chilling example of what happens when science, war, and reckless thinking collide. Would you be bold enough to spend a night on Anthrax Island? While you're thinking it over, be sure to hit subscribe. Archaeology and the military. What do soldiers and archaeologists have in common? Surprisingly, a lot. Whether it's uncovering lost cities, deciphering ancient battlefields, or just being really good at digging holes, military personnel have been shaping the field of archaeology for centuries. Let's take a moment to dig into some of history's greatest military archaeologists. After all, this is Origins Explained. One of the most famous military archaeologist crossovers comes from Augustus Henry Lane Fox. After spending 30 years in the British Army, fighting in the Crimean War and refining musket tactics, he turned his attention to unearthing ancient relics. His collection got so massive, accumulating 20,000 artifacts, that Oxford had to create an entire museum just to hold it. And Augustus wasn't the only one. Spanish military engineer Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre stumbled upon the buried Roman city of Herculaneum in 1738 while digging the foundation for a house. It was such an amazing experience, he went on to excavate Pompeii too. While some military men turned archaeologists found their calling after retirement, others multitasked. Take Eduard von Kali, for example, a German major general who used his strategic mind to assess ancient Rome forts along the empire's border. He figured out their importance and, instead of leveling them, helped preserve them. Or Charles Warren, a British royal engineer who was both a battlefield commander and an archaeologist of the Holy Land. When he wasn't busy fighting battles and digging up Jerusalem, he led the London police during the Jack the Ripper investigation. What a resume! And then there's Jane Dieulafoy, a French archaeologist who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Franco-Prussian War. She later went on to uncover Persian artifacts so valuable that the Louvre gave her 2 whole rooms for them. Now for the big guy. No discussion of military archaeologists would be complete without T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia. Long before he was leading revolts in the desert, he was scouring building sites for artifacts and making maps of the Middle East for British intelligence. Archaeology was his gateway to espionage. Lawrence's mentor, Leonard Woolley, also had a wild ride. He was captured as a POW during World War I, only to return later with a proposal that the biblical flood might have happened in real life. His proposal was based on layers of ancient silt that he discovered, pointing to a gigantic flood. Even World War II had its archaeologists out hunting mysteries. The Monuments Men was a group of art historians, museum curators, and archaeologists turned wartime detectives. They worked to track down and recover stolen artifacts. Their mission was to save the world's cultural heritage from being looted or bombed into oblivion. These experts even convinced military commanders to reroute battle plans to avoid destroying historic sites. Imagine trying to explain to a general mid-war, "Hey, could we not bomb that church? We know it's full of the enemy, but it's also kind of old." From ancient Rome to modern wars, the military and archaeology have been entwined in fascinating ways. The next time you visit a museum, remember some of those artifacts might have been unearthed by a battle-hardened general with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. Now don't go anywhere because we need to figure out who snitched on Anne Frank next. Anne Frank's betrayer revealed. Someone snitched on Anne Frank and got away with it. Then 77 years later, with some computer wizardry, an ex-FBI agent, and a small team of historians, that snitch may have finally been identified. Before divulging the snitch, let me just remind you of who exactly Anne Frank was. The young Jewish girl spent 2 years hiding from the Nazis before being captured and sent to a concentration camp in 1945. And there she died at only 15 years old. In the aftermath of the war and her death, Anne's diary was published. It's now the most famous first-hand account of what life was like for Jewish people during the war. Her diary is inspirational, terrifying, heartbreaking, and must be read with sunglasses so no one on the train sees you're crying. Now let's get down to business. The man who ratted out Anne Frank and her family to the Nazis may have been another Jewish person, making it so much worse. The potential culprit was Arnold van den Berg. In a desperate bid to save his own family, Arnold may have handed over Anne's hiding place to the Gestapo. Forget magnifying glasses and trench coats, this investigation was all about modern technology. A crack team spent 6 years using computer algorithms to sift through thousands of documents and connections. What would have taken humans decades to process was done with a few keystrokes and some data crunching. The team found out that van den Berg was sent to a concentration camp like other Jewish council members in the city. For some unknown reason, he was spared and allowed to just chill out in Amsterdam. Given that this is the Nazis I'm talking about, Arnold must have made some sort of deal with the devil to spare himself. The investigators found a copy of an anonymous note sent to Anne's father, Otto Frank, after the war. It straight up accused van den Berg of being the informant who snitched. But Otto never went public with this information, so it remained buried. Why didn't Otto reveal the guy who turned coat and ratted him out? Experts think he probably didn't want to add fuel to post-war anti-Semitism. He kept silent, and for almost 80 years, the mystery went unsolved. Regardless of whether van den Berg was the betrayer, this whole investigation should remind you of the impossible choices people were forced to make during one of history's darkest times. You have to ask yourself, if you had the Gestapo breathing down your neck, demanding names in exchange for your family's survival, what would you do? Would you sell out little Anne Frank? At the end of the day, Anne's legacy isn't about who betrayed her. It's about how her words still inspire millions. Her diary is proof that even in humanity's cloudiest moments, light still finds a way to shine through. The secret Aurora Spy Plane. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. According to the US government, the Aurora Spy Plane does not exist. It never has, and it never will. But like a stubborn conspiracy or that one uncle who insists he met Elvis in a grocery store, the rumors just won't end. Here's what the rumors say. After World War II, the Americans began developing a top-secret reconnaissance aircraft. It's such a complex machine that it didn't see the light of day until the 1980s. And now it's still such a secret that the government won't admit they built it. Official sources treat the Aurora Spy Plane like a ghost story for aviation nerds. And to be fair, there is no solid evidence this thing is real. But let's follow the trail anyway. The Aurora legend took off in 1985 when the Los Angeles Times and Aviation Week and Space Technology dropped a megaton shock bomb. Apparently, the Aurora plane was accidentally included in a classified section of the US budget. Oops. In 1987, $455 million was allocated for black aircraft production. Other reports suggested that an eye-watering $2.3 billion had been funneled into something called Project Aurora. That's a lot of taxpayer dollars for something that supposedly doesn't exist. Aviation industry experts of the late 80s believed the US had both the technology and the motivation to replace the aging SR-71 Blackbird with a new hypersonic spy plane. And if there's one thing the government loves, it's denying a project exists while also mysteriously losing billions of dollars. By the mid-90s, strange reports started surfacing of unidentified aircraft streaking across California and the UK, leaving behind bizarre contrails and sonic booms that rattled windows and nerves alike. One of the most famous sightings came in 1989. Engineer Chris Gibson, stationed on the GSF Galveston Key oil rig in the North Sea, saw a weird triangular plane refueling mid-air from a tanker flanked by 2 F-111 bombers. When a seasoned aviation expert stops and goes, "Wait a minute, that ain't normal," you pay attention. Gibson watched it for a few minutes, sketched the craft, and never did learn what he saw that day. Then there was the mysterious 1994 crash at RAF Boscombe Down in the UK. Reports claimed the crash involved a super-secret US black project, but before anyone could start snapping pictures, the base was swarmed by American personnel who didn't look like they were there to talk about the weather. The area was locked down so tight that even James Bond would have had trouble sneaking in. The official explanation was that the crash involved a towed missile decoy. Sure it did. Then came the unexplained sonic booms in Southern California in the early 1990s. Seismologists who usually track earthquakes suddenly found themselves tracking something way weirder. There were huge noises coming from an unidentified high-speed aircraft flying at around 90,000 feet, possibly hitting speeds between Mach 4 and Mach 5. Imagine if the Nazis had Mach 5 during the war, the Allies would have been out of luck. Considering NASA wasn't flying shuttles at the time, either someone was joyriding in a top-secret jet or aliens had finally stopped by to check out Disneyland. Dom Maglieri studied the booms over a 15-year period and concluded that something big and fast was out there. But as usual, nothing was ever officially linked to a specific aircraft. It was just more fuel for the Aurora fire. If this thing exists, it's been in development since around the end of World War II. I think the hardest part to believe is that the government could keep a secret this long. Do you think the Aurora plane is out there, or is this more of an ET situation? What would you do with your own personal spy plane? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for more awesome stuff from the channel.